Good day, everyone. I am Reese Niza, and I will be talking about Article 12.7 up to 12.11. So, Article 12.07, the concurrence of two or more creditors or two or more debtors in one and the same obligation does not imply that each one of the former has a right to demand or that each one of the latter is bound to render entire compliance with the prestation. There is a solidary liability only when the obligation expressly so states or when the law or the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. So, Article 1207 means that there are multiple creditors in an obligation. It doesn't automatically mean each creditor can demand the full payment or each debtor is responsible for paying the entire amount. Solidary liability, where any one debtor can be asked to pay the full debt or any creditor can demand the entire payment, only applies if the agreement specifically states it or if the law or nature of the obligation requires it. Without this clear indication, each party is typically only responsible for their share. So, this statement explains that just because there are multiple creditors or debtors in the obligation, it doesn't automatically mean that each creditor can demand the full payment or that each debtor is responsible for paying the whole amount. So under Article 1207, we have the joint obligation and the solidary obligation. So joint obligation is defined as an obligation where there is a concurrence of several creditors or of several debtors, or of several debtors, or of several creditors and debtors, by virtue of which each of the creditors has a right to demand, and each of the debtors is bound to render compliance with his proportionate part of the prestation, which constitutes the object of the obligation. Article 1208 of the Civil Code mandates the equal sharing of creditors in the payment of debt in the absence of any law or stipulation to the contrary. So, in a joint obligation, each debtor only pays their share of the debt. Creditors can only ask each debtor for their part, not the full amount. And then for the solidary obligation, it is an obligation where each one of the debtors is bound to render and or each of the creditors has a right to demand entire compliance with the prestation. So when we say solidary obligation, each debtor is responsible for the entire debt. Any creditor can ask any one debtor to pay the full amount. This can only happen if the agreement clearly says so, the law requires it, or the type of debt needs it. Next, we have the solidary debtor versus guarantor. We can say that at page 196. So, it is noted, however, the petitioner signed the promissory note as a solidary co-maker and not as a guarantor. So, when we say a solidary or joint and several obligation it is, katulad I mentioned before, it is each debtor is responsible for the entire debt. But when we say a guarantor binds himself to the creditor to fulfill the obligation of the principal debtor in case the latter should fail to do so. So, a guarantor is the one who promises to pay the debt only if the main debtor fails to pay it. Next is Article 1208 states, if from the law or the nature or the wording of the obligations to which the preceding article refers to the contrary does not appear, the credit or debt shall be presumed to be divided into as many shares as there are creditors or debtors, the credits or debts being considered distinct from one another, subject to the rules of court governing the multiplicity of suits. So, this article means that if the law or the agreement doesn't say otherwise, the debt or credit will be divided equally among the debtors or the creditors. So, each part will be treated separately. If there are multiple debtors or creditors, the total amount is split into equal shares. If there are legal actions about the separate parts, the rules of court will be used to handle them. So, the general rule in Article 1208 says that if there are multiple debtors or creditors in an obligation, it is usually considered a joint obligation. But there are exceptions. First exception is the obligation expressly so states that there is solidarity. If the agreement says clearly that it is then everyone involved can be asked to pay the full debt. Next is the law requires solidarity. Sometimes the law says that the obligation must be solidary, making each person fully responsible for the whole debt. And then the third exception is nature of the obligation requires solidarity. In certain situations, the type of debt means that everyone must share full responsibility for the entire amount. Next is Article 1209. So in the book, Article 1209, if the division is impossible, the right of the creditors may be prejudiced only by their collective acts, and the debt can be enforced only by proceeding against all the debtors. If one of the latter should be insolvent, the other shall not be liable for his share. So, this article states that if the can't be divided among the debtors, the creditors must take action together and go after all the debtors at once. If one debtor can't pay because they're broke or insolvent, the other debtors don't have to pay that person's share. Each debtor is only responsible for their own part of debt. The above article is referring to a joint indivisible obligation, wherein the nature of the rights and obligations of the parties are joint and the nature of the object of the obligation is indivisible. So when we say joint indivisible obligation, it means that the people involved share the responsibility for a task or debt, but the thing they owe or need to do cannot be divided. This happens when the object or the obligation, like a single item or task, cannot be split into parts. For example, if the debt is for something that can't be divided, like a single item or a task that must be done as a whole, everyone involved is still responsible for fulfilling the entire obligation, even though they share it. Now, the characteristics of a joint indivisible obligation is, number one, no joint creditor can act in representation of the other joint creditor or creditors. So, if there are multiple creditors, they all need to ask for the payment. If one creditor doesn't, the debtor can refuse to pay or can choose to deposit the owed item until all creditors are involved. Number two, no joint debtor can be compelled to fulfill the obligation of the other joint debtor or debtors. So, if there are multiple debtors, each one is only responsible for their part. All debtors must agree to fulfill the debt. If one debtor can't pay, if they're broke, the others don't have to cover that person's share. So, the effect of breach of joint and divisible obligation. In case of breach, if one of the debtors in a joint and divisible obligation fails to fulfill their part, the debt becomes indemnity for damages. Meaning, debtor who didn't comply will be responsible for paying all the damages to the creditor or creditors. However, the debtors who are ready to meet their obligation won't have to pay the full damage. They will only be responsible for paying a portion of the damages that corresponds to their share of the debt, based on the price or value of what they were supposed to fulfill. So, that's it for the joint indivisible obligation. Now, Article 1210 states that the indivisibility of an obligation does not necessarily give rise to solidarity, nor does solidarity of itself imply indivisibility. So, the indivisibility of an obligation means the debt or task cannot be divided, but this doesn't automatically make it solidary, where each debtor is responsible for the entire debt. Similarly, just because of an obligation is solidary, where all debtors share full responsibility, it doesn't mean the obligation is indivisible. In other words, indivisibility or solidarity are two separate concepts, and one doesn't necessarily lead to the other. Lastly, we have Article 1211. Solidarity may exist, although the creditors and the debtors may not be bound in the same manner and by the same periods and conditions. Article 1211 explains that solidarity can exist if the creditors and debtors have different roles or responsibilities or are bound by different time periods or conditions. So, there are different kinds of solidarity. Solidarity as to source, we have legal solidarity, conventional solidarity, and we have the real solidarity. In the book, it states that legal solidarity is the solidarity is imposed by law. This type of solidarity, the law automatically makes the obligation solidary, meaning the parties involved are bound together and each is responsible for the entire obligation. No agreement between the parties is needed. It is required by law, Rajod. And then we have the conventional solidarity. The solidarity is agreed upon the parties. So, in this case, they decide among themselves that each will be responsible for the entire obligation. This type of solidarity comes from an agreement between the parties. Next is the real solidarity. The solidarity is imposed by the nature of the obligation. So, the nature of the debt or obligation makes it necessary for all parties to be solidary. It arises from the specific circumstances or characteristics of the obligation. Solidarity as to the parties bound, we have the active solidarity, passive solidarity, and mixed solidarity. When we say active solidarity, it is when there are multiple creditors and each can collect the entire debt from the debtor, even though they only own a share. For example, if a debtor owes 300,000 pesos to 3 creditors, any one of them can collect the full amount but must give the other creditors their share. On the other hand, the passive solidarity, it involves multiple debtors and each debtor is responsible for the whole debt from the creditor's point of view, even though each only owes their share. So, if 3 debtors owe 300,000 pesos, they are each responsible for the full amount. And if one cannot pay, the others may not cover it. Lastly, the mixed solidarity. Solidarity among the debtors and creditors. It means that there are multiple debtors who are all responsible for paying the entire debt. And there are also multiple creditors who can each demand the full debt from any of the debtors. Both the debtors and the creditor share the responsibility and right to pay and collect the full amount. Lastly is solidarity as to uniformity. We have the uniform solidarity and the non-uniform or varied solidarity. Uniform solidarity, the parties are bound by the same stipulation. So if in this type of solidarity, all parties, the debtors and creditors, are bound by the same terms in the agreement. Everyone has the same rights and obligations, meaning they all share the same responsibilities in the obligation. And when we say the non-uniform or the varied solidarity, the parties are not subject to the same stipulations. In this type of solidarity, the parties involved may have different terms or conditions in the obligation. Not all debtors or creditors are bound in the same way. For instance, some debtors might be responsible for different portions of the debt, or the creditors may have different rights to collect the debt. So, the responsibility or rights of each party can vary even though the obligation is still solidary.
Article 1212 states that each one of the solidary creditors may do whatever may be useful to the others, but not anything which may be prejudicial to the latter. So a solidary creditor can do anything that can benefit other creditors. So for example, we have 3 creditors: creditor A, creditor B, and creditor C. They are involved in a solidary obligation with debtor X amounted to 300,000 pesos. So the situation is creditor A contacted debtor X and she take all the actions to collect all the payment. And then when she successfully collect the 300,000 pesos, she equally divided it to creditor B and creditor C. So this action is allowed under 1212, under Article 1212, since creditor A take all the actions to collect the payment that benefits creditor B and creditor C. So that is Article 1212. Now let's proceed to Article 1213. So this article states that a solidary creditor cannot assign his rights without the consent of others. So this is the general rule. A creditor cannot assign his rights without the consent of others. So for example, the same situation, we have three creditors, creditor A, creditor B, and creditor C, which is involved in a solidary obligation with debtor X amounted to 300,000 pesos. So in this situation, creditor A decides to transfer the rights to assignee Z. So this would mean that assignee Z could now collect the payment amounted to 300,000 pesos to debtor X. But creditor A cannot assign assignee Z to collect the payment without first obtaining the consent of creditor B and creditor C. So if creditor B and creditor C will not agree, this means that creditor A cannot transfer the rights to assignee Z. So that is Article 1213. Now, Article 1214 states that the debtor may pay any one of the solidary creditors, but if any demand, judicial or extrajudicial, has been made by one of them, payment should be made to him. So, still three creditors, creditor A, creditor B, and creditor C, which is involved in a solidary obligations with debtor X amounted to 300,000 pesos. So if no one of the creditors will make a demand to debtor X can choose to pay to any one of them. But when creditor A make a demand, judicial, either judicial or extrajudicial, now debtor X is required to pay the full payment to creditor A, even though creditor B and creditor C wants to receive the payment. So in this matter, creditor A is now obliged to divide the payment amounted to 300,000 pesos with creditor B and creditor C. Article 1215 states that novation, compensation, confusion, or remission of the debt made by any of the solidary creditors or with any of the solidary debtors shall extinguish the obligation without prejudice to the provisions of Article 1219. The creditor who may have executed any of these acts, as well as he who collects the debt, shall be liable to the others for the share in the obligation corresponding to them. So, novation, compensation, confusion, or remission of the debt, if a creditor or a debtor have executed any of these acts, the obligation shall be extinguished. So, novation. What is novation? Novation is a mode of extinguishing an obligation by changing the object of principal conditions, or by substituting the person of the debtor, or by subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. For example, B and C solidarily owes X and Y the amount of 100,000 pesos. And then B and C agreed to X only, that instead of paying the amount of 100,000 pesos, they will just deliver a specific car. So upon the delivery of B and C of a specific car to X, the obligation is extinguished. Nonetheless, X is liable for the share of Y, which is amounted to 50,000 pesos. Next is compensation. Compensation shall take place when two persons in their own right are creditors and debtors of each other. For example, B and C, solidarily debtors of X and Y, amounted to 400,000 pesos. But in another transaction, X owes B 400,000 pesos also. So if X and B agreed to compensation, the obligation will be extinguished. However, C is still liable to give B 200,000 pesos, and X is still liable to give Y 200,000 pesos, for his rights should not be prejudiced and he still can recover his share. Third is confusion or merger of rights. So this is when the characters of creditor and debtor are merged in the same person. For example, B B and C solidarily debtors owes X and Y amount to 100,000 pesos as evidence of negotiable promissory note. Then X and Y negotiated this promissory note, then H. Then the latter negotiated this to I, and then to J, and then to K, and then to L, and then back to B only. So in this case, the obligation is extinguished. But then, C is still liable to give his share to B, which is amounted to 50,000 pesos. So that is confusion or merger of rights. Lastly is the remission of condonation. So this is when the creditor voluntarily forgives or cancels the debt, releasing the debtor from their obligation. So B and C solidarily debtors owes X and Y amounted to the amount of 100,000 pesos. But before the date matures, X voluntarily remitted the obligation in favor of B. So the obligation is extinguished. But without the consent of Y, X is liable to give Y his share, which is 50,000 pesos. But C is not liable to give B his share, because as the same with the principle of the solidary obligation, which is all for one for all, then the remission of one is the remission of all. So that is Article 1215. So now, let's tackle about Article 1216. So it states that the creditor may proceed against any one of the solidary debtors or some or all of them simultaneously. The demand made against one of them shall not be an obstacle to those which may subsequently be directed against the others, so long as the debt has not been fully collected. So the creditor can choose to demand payment from any of the debtors. It can also be in all of the debtors. So for example, if there are 3 debtors, the creditor can choose to demand payment from debtor A, debtor B, or all of the 3 debtors simultaneously. And when the payment is not fully collected, the creditor has a right to still collect the payment in any of them or in all of them.
Article 1217 of the Civil Code of the Philippines, extinguishment of solidary obligation, states that payment made by one of the solidary debtors extinguishes the obligation. If 2 or more solidary debtors offer to pay, the creditor may choose which offer to accept. He who made the payment may claim from his co-debtors only the share which corresponds to each, with the interest for the payment already made. If the payment is made before the debt is due, no interest for the anticipated payment may be demanded. What this means is that in a solidary obligation, each debtor is liable for the entire debt. If one debtor pays the full amount, the entire obligation is extinguished. This results to the paying debtor has given the right to demand reimbursement from co-debtors for their respective shares. If payment is made before the due date, interest cannot be demanded from co-debtors. A good example is entity A, B, and C are solidary debtors, owing 90,000 pesos to company X. Entity A pays the entire 90,000 pesos to company X. Therefore, the obligation is extinguished. Entity A can demand 30,000 pesos each from entity B and C, since they are equally liable. In application, this article ensures that a creditor is paid regardless of which debtor makes the payment, while allowing the paying debtor to seek reimbursement. In Article 1218, effect of remission, debt forgiveness on solidary debtors. It states that the remission of the share which affects one of the solidary debtors does not release the obligation of the others. The creditor may still enforce the obligation against the others for the balance. What this means is that if a creditor forgives the debt of one debtor, it does not automatically extinguish the obligation of the others. The remaining debtors may still pay the total amount minus the share of the forgiven debtor. Example: Entity A, B, and C again are solidary debtors for 90,000 pesos. The creditor X decides to forgive entity B's share, which is 30,000 pesos. But A and C still owe the remaining 60,000 pesos for company X. In application, this protects the creditor's right to collect payment while ensuring fairness among the remaining debtors. Now, let's move on. Article 1219, Compensation or Confusion in Solidary Obligation. It states that the compensation or confusion which takes place in the person of one of the solidary debtors shall not extinguish the obligation except as regards the debtor's share. What this means is that compensation occurs when a debtor and creditor owe each other and their debts cancel out. Kanang pareho sila o kanang utang kibali yung dyan murag mag-cancel na yun na nang mawa na kibali manal ang ilang compensation. Therefore, confusion happens when a debtor becomes the creditor. A debtor inherits the right of the creditor. If either occurs for one debtor, it only affects their share, and the others must still pay their part. Example, again, entity A, B, and C owe 90,000 pesos to X, but X also owes 30,000 pesos to A in a separate transaction. Since A is both debtor and creditor for 30,000 pesos, this amount is compensated or cancelled out. But B and C still need to pay 30,000 pesos each to X. In application, this ensures that personal circumstances affecting one debtor do not automatically discharge the entire debt for all co-debtors. Now, in Article 1220, Effect of Novation on Solidary Debtors. It states that the novation, compensation, confusion, or remission of the debt of one of the solidary debtors shall not extinguish the obligation of the others, unless the creditor expressly so declares. This means that novation occurs when an old obligation is replaced by a new one, like the changing of terms, replacing debtors, or modifying conditions, like nabago ang ilang sabot, nga na. If novation applies to only one debtor, the others remain liable unless the creditor explicitly states that the entire obligation is extinguished. Example, A, B, and C owe 90,000 pesos to X. X agrees to change the obligation so that B no longer owes anything. B no longer owes anything. Unless X declares that the entire debt is cancelled, A and C must still pay their shares. In application, this prevents the automatic discharge of all solidary debtors due to agreements involving only one of them. In Article 1221, Rights of the Paying Solidary Debtor states that a solidary debtor who pays for the entire obligation may demand reimbursement from his co-debtors for their shares with interest. If one of them is insolvent, the loss shall be divided among all remaining debtors, including the one who paid. This means that a solidary debtor who pays the full obligation can demand reimbursement from co-debtors. They can charge interest from the time of payment. If a co-debtor is insolvent or unable to pay, their share is divided among the remaining debtors, including the one who paid. Example, again, A, B, and C owe 90,000 pesos to X. A pays the full amount to X, but B and C must reimburse A for 30,000 pesos each, similar to Article 1217. But, in this case, if C is insolvent, the remaining 30,000 pesos is split between A and B, which will be 15,000 each. In application, this ensures fairness among co-debtors while allowing the creditor to receive full payment without delay.
According to Article 1222, a solidary debtor may in actions filed by the creditor avail himself of all defenses which are derived from the nature of the obligation and of those which are personal to him, or pertain to his own share. With respect to those which personally belong to the others, he may avail himself thereof only as regards that part of the debt for which the latter are responsible. In civil terms, if multiple people owe a debt together and one person pays everything, they have the right to demand repayment from the others, but if one of them cannot pay due to insolvency, the remaining debtors must split the unpaid portion. Let's say, for example, Anna, Ben, and Chris are solidary debtors for a 90,000 pesos loan. Anna pays the full amount. Normally, Ben and Chris must each reimburse Anna 30,000 pesos. But if Ben is insolvent, Anna and Chris will split his share. So instead of 30,000 pesos each, Chris will pay 45,000 pesos and Anna absorbs the remaining loss. There are three defenses against reimbursement. The first one is defenses derived from the nature of the obligation or total defense. If the obligation is void or already extinguished, all solidary co-debtors can use this defense. For example, if the loan was declared void due to fraud, Anna cannot demand reimbursement from Ben and Chris. The second one is defenses personal to the debtor or total or partial defense, which means a solidary debtor may have a defense that applies only to their own share. If it completely cancels their obligation, it's a total defense. Otherwise, it's partial. For example, if Chris was a minor when he became a debtor, he can refuse to pay his share, but Anna and Ben remain liable. And the third one is defenses personal to other solidary debtors or partial defense, which means a solidary debtor can only use another debtor's personal defense for the part that debtor should have paid. For example, if Ben was deceived into signing the loan agreement, he can refuse to pay his share, but Anna and Chris must still pay their portions.
Section 5. Divisible and indivisible obligation. Article 1223 states that divisibility or indivisibility of the thing that are the objects of obligation, in which there is only one debtor and only one creditor, does not alter or modify the provisions of Chapter 2 of this title. So what is divisible obligation? It means the capability to deliver partial performance. Example, the obligation to deliver 10 sacks of rice, while the indivisible obligation is not capable to deliver partial performance. Example is to deliver a specific car. There are also divisible and indivisible thing. Divisible thing is a thing is divisible when if separated into parts, its essence is not changed or its value is not decreased. While indivisible thing is a thing indivisible when if separated into parts, its essence is changed or its value is decreases disproportionately. Kinds of division. There are three kinds of division: quantitative, qualitative, and intellectual. Quantitative. The division is quantitative when the thing can be materially divided into parts. Such parts are homogeneous to each other. An example is the obligation of Mr. A to deliver 10 sacks of rice to Mr. B and C. Qualitative. The division is qualitative when the thing can be materially divided, but the parts are not homogeneous to each other, such as in the partition of an inheritance. Example, Mr. A got a land, while Mr. B got a house. Mr. C got a car. Intellectual. The division is intellectual when the thing can only be separated into ideal or undivided parts. Example is when Mr. A, Mr. B, and Mr. C inherits from their father one parcel of land. They own 1/3 each of the said parcel of land. Effects of a breach of a joint indivisible obligation. In case of a breach of a joint indivisible obligation, it is converted into an indemnity for damages. The joint debtors who failed or refused to comply with his obligation shall bear burden of paying all the damages to the creditor or joint creditors. For those joint debtors who may have been ready to comply with their obligation shall not contribute to the indemnity beyond the corresponding portion of the price of the thing or the value of the service in which the obligation consists. Example, Mr. A and B oblige themselves to deliver a specific car having a price of 1 million to Mr. C and D on December 31, 2020, the obligation is presumed to be joint and the object is indivisible by its nature. Thus, this is a joint indivisible obligation upon beyond by Mr. C and D. While Mr. A is willing to deliver, but Mr. B refused to comply with his obligation accordingly, the obligation is converted into indemnity for damages. Mr. A is liable for his share of 500,000, while Mr. B is liable for 500,000 plus damages and interest. Take note that it is only Mr. B who is liable for damages and interest because of his refusal to comply with his obligation. So si Mr. B ra ang makabayad og damages kay si Jara man ang ning refuse or ning di to comply his obligation to deliver a 1 million pesos car. Article 1225 paragraph 1 states that for the purpose of the preceding articles, obligation to give definite things and those which are not susceptible of partial performance shall be deemed to be indivisible. Paragraph 2. When the obligation has for its object the execution of a certain number of days of work, the accomplishment of work by metrical units or analog things which by their natures are susceptible of partial performance, it shall be divisible. Paragraph 3. However, even though the object or service may be physically divisible, an obligation is indivisible if so provided by law or intended by the parties. An obligation not to do, indivisibility or indivisibility shall be determined by the character of the presentation in each particular case. So this means that whether an obligation is divisible or indivisible depends on primarily on its object or subject matter. If the nature of the obligation allows it to be performed in parts, example payment of money in installments, it is considered divisible. If the obligation must be performed as a whole, example is delivering a specific car, it is indivisible unless the party agrees otherwise. Obligation deemed indivisible. Obligation to give definite things are those which are not susceptible of their partial performance. Example, the obligation of Mr. A to give his only laptop to Mr. B, or the obligation of Mr. A to conduct a one-day lecture on obligations and contracts. Obligation shall be divisible when the obligation has for its object the execution of a certain number of days of work, the accomplishment of work by metrical units or analog things which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance. Example is the obligation of Mr. A to clean the house of Mr. B in 2 days, or the obligation of Mr. A to pay the amount of 100,000 in for equal monthly installment to Mr. B. There are also exceptions. Even though the object or service may be physically divisible, an obligation is indivisible if so provided by law or intended by the parties. Example, if the obligation of Mr. A to pay Mr. Y the amount of 100,000 cash on December 16, 2020, the intention of Mr. A and Mr. B is one-time payment. Section 6. Obligation with a penal clause. Article 1226 states in obligation with a penal clause, the penalty shall substitute the indemnity for damages and the payment of interest in case of non-compliance. If there is no stipulation in the contrary, nevertheless, damages shall be paid if the obliger refuses to pay the penalty, or it's guilty of fraud, the fulfillment of the obligation. The penalty may be enforced only when it is demandable in accordance with the provision of this code. So it means if ever obligation is with a penal clause and not rendered, consequence or punishment may arise, like the payment of damages and the payment of interest if ever not complied. Penal clause. A penal clause is an accessory undertaking to assume greater liability in case of breach. It is a form of guarantee for the fulfillment of an obligation by establishing an aggravation of responsibility. Example of penal clause is Mr. A promised to deliver a particular TV to Mr. B on December 31, 2020. As an additional stipulation, they agreed that Mr. A will be liable to pay 5,000 pesos penalty in case of failure to deliver the said obligation and maturity date. The principal obligation here is the delivery of the TV, and the accessories obligation is the penalty of 5,000 in case of default.
Article 1227. The Article 1227 states that the debtor cannot exempt himself from the performance of the obligation by paying the penalty, save in the case where this right has been expressly reserved for him. Neither can the creditor demand the fulfillment of the obligation and the satisfaction of the penalty at the same time, unless this right has been clearly granted him. However, if after the creditor has decided to require the fulfillment of the obligation, the performance therefore should become impossible without his fault, the penalty may be enforced. Generally, the debtor cannot substitute penalty for the principal obligation. The general rule is that the debtor is not allowed to just pay the penalty instead of fulfilling the obligation. He can only do so if the right has been expressly reserved. The reason is that if he can just pay, fulfillment of the obligation will be considered an alternative one. The word expressly means that any implied reservation is not allowed. For example, a promises to finish a certain piece of work within 6 months. The contract stipulates that in case he does not build the house at all, he is supposed to forfeit the sum of 1 million pesos. In this case, as a general rule, the contractor cannot just give the sum of 1 million pesos as a substitute for his non-performance of the obligation. It must be remembered that as a general rule, therefore, the penal clause is not supposed to substitute the performance of the principal obligation. He may, however, be expressly granted by the creditor the right to refrain from the execution of the contract by a forfeiture of the penalty. Generally, creditor cannot demand both fulfillment and the penalty at the same time. As a general rule, the creditor does not have this right to demand fulfillment of the obligation and the penalty at the same time. The exception arises when such a right has been clearly granted to him. Article 1228 states that proof of actual damages suffered by the creditor is not necessary in order that the penalty may be demanded. That means penalty demandable without proof of actual damages. In an obligation with a penal clause, all that the creditor has to prove to enforce the penalty is the violation of the obligation by the debtor. It is not necessary to adduce evidence to prove losses and damages suffered by the creditor or the extent of the same. Indeed, one of the reasons of fixing the penalty is to avoid such necessity and other difficulties involved in litigations. The creditor may enforce the penalty whether he suffered damages or not, but he cannot recover more than the stipulated penalty even if he proves that the amount of his damages exceeds the penalty. Damages recoverable in addition to penalty must be proved. Article 1228 applies only where the penalty is fixed by the parties to substitute the indemnity for damages. For example, Cheese Caldero entered into a contract with building contractor Mark Billiards to build a resort-type residential community at his hacienda. Under their deal, Mark Billiards should complete the project in 12 months. Otherwise, Mark Billiards will pay Cheese Caldero a penalty of 1 million pesos for each month of delay in the project. Mark Billiards failed to complete the project within the specified time frame, and the result of which Cheese Caldero could not start the sale of properties in his new residential community. In this case, Cheese does not need to prove to court the actual damages brought by the breach, and he only needs to prove that Mark Billiards failed to complete the project within the specified time frame, and the result of which Cheese Caldero could not start the sale of properties in his new residential community. In this case, Cheese does not need to prove to court the actual damages brought by the breach, and he only needs to prove that Mark Billiards failed to complete the project within 12 months as stipulated in their contract so that he can obtain the 1 million pesos per month of penalty.
Article 1229. The Article 1229 states that the judge shall equitably reduce the penalty when the principal obligation has been partly or irregularly complied with by the debtor. Even if there has been no performance, the penalty may also be reduced by the courts if it is iniquitous or unconscionable. In judicial reduction of penalty, first, when the obligation has been partly complied with by the debtor. So, the first refers to the extent of fulfillment, the latter to the manner. The penalty should be more or less proportionate with the extent of the breach of the contract or of the damage suffered. Second, when the penalty is iniquitous or unconscionable, even if there has been no performance at all. So here, the penalty may be reduced even if there is no performance at all, even if iniquitous or unconscionable. Liquidated damages, whether intended as an indemnity or as a penalty, are not void, but subject merely to equitable reduction.
Let's move on to Article 1230. The Article 1230 states that the nullity of the penal clause does not carry with it that of the principal obligation. The nullity of the principal obligation carries with it that of the penal clause. So, if the penal clause is void, such as when it is contrary to law, morals, or good customs, public order, or public policy, the principal obligation will remain subsisting. For example, A obliged himself to pay B the amount of 100,000 pesos on March 30, 2019. Should he fail to deliver the said amount at the said due date, an additional 30% interest will incur. Under this example, the main obligation is valid, which is the payment of 100,000, but the penalty clause is unlawful for being iniquitous. Under the law, the main obligation must be complied with and the penal clause must be disregarded. And that ends our discussion. Thank you.